It's a fairly sad indictment on both our politicians and our media that while we could have been having an adult conversation about negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, we've instead been provided confused messaging with a side order of gaslighting. The PM, seemingly caught underprepared, has been giving interviews that alternate between car crash and train wreck, tying himself in knots and fumbling the ball when he really should be taking a free kick. It all really started when news leaked that Labor had asked Treasury to look at options for scaling back negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions. I'm always a little sceptical of leaks because you'll find that in a lot of cases they are more planned information drops than anything, designed to gauge public reaction to a policy or decision a government may or may not pursue. Kind of like dipping your toe into the swimming pool before committing to diving in. The toe dipping is usually organised and politicians come out well rehearsed in how to address related questions the media will no doubt have. But this negative gearing thing, if this was a toe-dipping exercise, Labor made an absolute meal of it. They certainly didn't sound prepared. Following the initial story in the 9 papers, it was hard to keep track of what was happening and who was doing what or what had been done. It was a mess. Maybe it was events in the Senate the week prior that lit the spark.
I think he means light the fuse.
But Albo was clearly a frustrated fellow when he appeared on RM Breakfast.
It is a pretty incremental, small policy, Prime Minister. Are you looking at broader, bigger reforms to housing? And are you willing to negotiate around anything that the Greens are putting on the table? Is there any movement on something like negative gearing?
Well, they're not putting anything on the table.
Well, they are. You might not like it, but they are. They're saying they want negative gearing reform, capital gains tax reform. They are. So are you prepared to look at those things?
They're tax measures. They're not what this legislation's about, and this legislation is their policy that they are voting against. They voted against the Housing Australia Future Fund last year and delayed it for month after month after month. This legislation has been in the Parliament for 200 days without being carried. And the senators, they must like talking to each other because they haven't either voted for or against any legislation this week. That's the important thing here, Patricia, for your listeners, that they have sat now. Today will be the 4th day of a Senate-only sitting week in which they have not either passed
But isn't that partly on you, your side of politics too, Prime Minister, that you, in the past, have been able to get the Greens across the line by negotiating? You don't appear to be doing that this time.
The Greens have eventually, after delaying, voted for the Housing Australia Future Fund. We didn't get them across the line. They whinged that we were putting additional money into housing through other forms, such as the Social Housing Accelerator.
But there was more money put on the table.
No, it wasn't, Patricia. I
watched the timeline of events. I think there was more money delivered.
There was $2 billion delivered to states and territories in the June in return for them fixing existing housing. That work is underway. The Greens complained at the time that they didn't know anything about it.
Okay, you're saying they had no influence on mounting pressure on the government?
Patricia, they continue to block. It's up to them to justify why they are blocking legislation that they say, Adam Bant says, it either has merits or it doesn't. If it doesn't have merit, vote against it. But I believe helping 40,000 Australians into home ownership does have merits. This is a scheme that has worked all around the world, and it would be just another element as part of our $32 billion plan.
So just to get some absolute clarity, Prime Minister, as we go in, it's some time away, but into an election period, are you saying negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions are absolutely off the table for you?
Well, they're tax policies.
Yeah, but are those tax policies,
housing policies,
are those tax policies completely off the table for you?
Well, Patricia, I don't answer the sort of those sort of questions in the way that
you mean good ones.
Yeah,
that's a good question. Are you going to say no to those or not?
Clever. They're things that journalists. The next question is when will the election be?
I know that's not my next question.
Yeah, well, they're not terribly clever questions. You ask all of that. We're interested in the tax policy that we are implementing, not the ones that we're not. And we have been very clear about that.
So you're not interested in those ideas?
Well, people voted in 2019 on some of those ideas. They were rejected. And what we are interested in when it comes to housing is things that will increase supply. Now, there is a whole lot of economists will tell you that the measures that you talk about will not increase supply, and the danger is they will decrease supply. The key to housing affordability is to get more homes.
Whether you like her or not, the question from Patricia Cavalis was a valid one. If the PM is incapable of dealing with obvious questions like these, perhaps he's better off just running his communications through Kyle and Jackie O. Anyway, Albo would appear on Sydney Drive the day the negative gearing story was published, where he was asked some fairly basic questions.
Can I first ask you about all these reports that you're considering changes to negative gearing? It seems every headline, every newspaper in the country's got a headline saying negative gearing is back on the table. Is it?
No, it's not our policy. I note that all of these reports don't have any names attached to it, and that apparently Treasury's doing some work on policy. Well, that's what Treasury do. We respect the public service. Lots of people look at lots of things, but it's certainly not our policy. Our policy is our $32 billion Homes for Australia plan.
Okay, but here's, Prime Minister, to interrupt, here's the sharp question. Have you asked Treasury to examine possible changes to both negative gearing and the capital gains discount?
No, I certainly haven't.
Has your Treasurer, though?
Well, the department, like all departments, look at various things at various times. So is this government policy or government request to examine potential policy announcement? No, it's not.
But it's a fair question to ask you whether you or your Treasurer has requested this study.
Sure, and I've answered that.
You've answered it for yourself, but not for the Treasurer.
Well, I'm not the Treasurer.
But you must have said to, hey, Jim, did you ask them to do this?
No, not at all.
So sorry, you don't know whether your Treasurer has asked them to do this work or not?
Well, I don't know because I'm not the Treasurer, and the Treasurer is on his way to China as we speak. But what we have done is to concentrate on our Homes for Australia plan. What I can say is, at no level of the government has there been a debate about anything other than getting our Homes for Australia plan through. And those meetings include, obviously, in our cabinet, and those processes include, obviously, the Treasurer and other ministers as well. What we're concentrating on is delivering the Homes for Australia plan, some of which is caught up in the Senate.
I suppose everyone's question, I think it's a fair question, is are they doing this on their own accord or have they been asked to do it by the government?
Yeah, and I've answered that very clearly. It's not what our policy approach is. Our policy approach is very clear and is out there, and some of which, in terms of our build-to-rent scheme and our help-to-buy scheme. So two schemes, one aimed at getting people into home ownership, the second aimed at increasing private rentals and the building of supply. Both of those measures are what are stuck in the Senate, and that is our only concentration. That is what we have only been focused on.
Okay, but you sound as if you're unsure of whether the Treasurer has made this request of Treasury or not.
Well, if you ask me speculative questions, I'm unsure of what you had for breakfast this morning. There are no names attached. There are no politicians attached. There's no suggestion in the report which is there. The speculative report, there's no suggestion even that there's comments from any minister or any member of Parliament.
I suppose just
let alone the Treasurer or the Prime Minister.
But because it is such a difficult subject, I mean, some people say it lost you the last election because it's such a difficult subject.
Well, we won the last election, Richard.
Sorry, the one before. Sorry, Mr. Shorten's election. Given that, people might say, given all the headlines today, you would at least phone up the Treasurer and say, is it true that you asked them to do this?
Well, he's on a plane, and what we've been concentrating on is the real issue, which is the inflation coming down today. And I know what the Treasurer has been involved in, and the Treasurer has been involved in trying to get our Homes for Australia plan through the Parliament, as has the entire government.
Will you ask him the question once he lands?
Oh, you could ask him yourself.
Fair enough.
Honestly, at this point, he could probably have knocked the whole thing on the head. If the government are genuinely considering potential changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, then they'd be better served being upfront about it. Just say that you're seeking expert advice and analysis. Housing is one of the greatest challenges facing the country. A government facing a challenge this big needs to be prepared to explore all possible options to resolve it. Just say something like that. I mean, anything. Don't
Crikey dingo.
hit the bed just to jump on morning TV the next day to barf out this.
Look, my view is that the key to housing policy is supply, and that has been the objective of our $32 billion Homes for Australia plan. More public housing, more build to rent that's stuck in the Senate for private rentals, more home ownership that's also stuck.
It took all of about 24 hours for the PM to start parroting property council lines.
And the issue of negative gearing is one of supply. Will it add to supply or will it decrease supply? The figures and research that has been produced by organisations like the Property Council indicate that it would reduce supply and therefore not contribute to solving the issue. And that's the issue. We just want to get on with our plan of building more homes in the Homes for Australia plan. It's a serious objective that we have.
Unfortunately, as Greg Jericho from the Australia Institute points out, the report the PM is referring back to in his case against changes to negative gearing actually does the opposite. To summarise, the report demonstrates that if the government were to pursue negative gearing changes, housing affordability will improve. Home ownership in 10 years would have risen 2.5 percentage points, the biggest 10-year improvement since the 1970s. The total stock of housing, even with outdated assumptions of investor behaviour, would be just 0.4% lower than otherwise would have been the case. And rents would barely change. You can find the Australia Institute article here. And all of that is before you get to the other benefit, and that is the billions of dollars the government would be able to direct towards the housing crisis.
So you're considering taking negative gearing reform and capital gains tax reform to the next election?
No, we're not. What we're doing is planning for our Homes for Australia policy.
Do you think, as it stands, that negative gearing has been equitable for all Australians? Has it, over time, locked some Australians out of the housing market?
Well, that's the question of whether it's contributing to supply or not. For many people, of course, if you didn't have investment in housing, you wouldn't have private rentals. You would have less supply and less construction is the concern which is there. Now, our build to rent scheme, for example, which will provide incentives through the tax system for more construction of housing, is being blocked in the Senate.
Since the PM's fond of referring to the Property Council, here's a quick reminder of what the Property Council thought of the Build to Rent bill and what impact it would have on housing supply.
With the legislation as it is currently drafted, how many additional units are forecast over and above what would have been built anyway?
What would we get under the current kind of bill? In our submission, we highlighted there are some technical issues that basically restrict application of any concessional rate. Virtually no build-to-rent platform in Australia would be able to access it. So based on the way the bill is drafted at the moment, we don't think any additional build-to-rent apartments would be produced over and above business as usual.
That sounds terrific.
Who directed Treasury to take a look at negative gearing, to bring some analysis to the government? Can you confirm who was it that asked for that?
Treasury don't need to be directed. They're not school children with teachers up the front of the class telling them what to do. I want a public service that looks at ideas, that looks at policy. That's why we have a public service that's dynamic and creative.
Wait, there's more.
Well, we have no plans to touch or change negative gearing. What we're concerned about is supply of housing, and I'm not convinced it'll make any difference that's positive when it comes to supply. That's why we actually have our $32 billion Homes for Australia plan. that's about building more public housing through the Housing Australia Future Fund.
Just going to pause him here for a tick. I've noticed he's been saying that the Housing Australia Future Fund will be building more public housing. But here's the deal. When the HAF hoo-ha was going on, public housing barely rated a mention. It was all social and affordable housing. The explanatory memorandum spells that out. 20,000 homes for social housing, 10,000 for affordable housing. Now the sneaky part. Despite submissions made during the bill's draft stage, including from the Community Housing Industry Association, the government decided not to define what they meant by affordable housing or even social housing for that matter. The definition of affordable housing will vary depending on who you ask and is not consistent across state to state. And social housing, well, that's an umbrella term that includes community housing and can also include public housing. The way in which the bill was set up suggests that for the social housing component, the government will be relying solely on community housing providers. In the first round of funding, it's reported that the majority of applications came from community housing providers backed by institutional investors. So the money will be going towards subsidising providers' revenue over a longer term. Look, I may well be proven wrong, but I find it very unlikely that the HAF, as it currently stands, is going to deliver much, if any, genuine, government-owned and managed public housing. What I do find curious, though, is the Labor government's change of tact when it comes to messaging and what they say the HAF will deliver. And before I forget, in their big HAF announcement a few weeks back, they dropped an impressive-sounding 13,700 homes figure.
Wow.
Sadly, only 700 of those will be delivered within this financial year, with most not available for at least another 2 years. And the kicker? Of the 13,700 homes, only 4,200 of them will be for social housing. The rest are the ambiguously labelled and undefined affordable housing. And a quick reminder that when the social housing shortfall is put at 640,000 homes or more, you can pretty quickly see the problem. 4,200 homes delivered over the next couple of years would barely register a ripple in terms of the current unmet demand in Victoria alone, let alone Australia-wide.
If we go to the current issue of negative gearing capital gains tax, might you change course?
Well, it's not a current issue.
Even though it certainly is.
No,
it's on the front pages of every
issue,
paper
Pete.
at the moment. When you say there are no plans to change
that doesn't mean it's real. That doesn't mean it's real.
But when you say there are no plans to change capital gains tax or negative gearing, could those plans change?
Well, if you ask the same question, Peter, you get the same answer.
Well, I'm not getting a response to it. So can I ask again, could those plans change?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. You're not listening, Peter. You've already asked it, and I've already answered it.
Yeah, but I'm asking. You said no plans, but could plans change? Well, Peter, if you want to keep interrupting me, then this won't be. we won't get anywhere. I have said why I have a problem with changing, which is that it's about supply, and the problem is that all of the analysis shows that a change to negative gearing will not assist supply, and my government is focused on more supply of housing, more public housing, more private rentals, more home ownership. That's the key.
If, as the PM seems to be hoping, changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions have no impact on supply, then that should still be considered a green light to pursue them, in my opinion, because modelling from the Parliamentary Budget Office has already been done to demonstrate how much money the government would be spending to maintain the status quo over the next decade. We know it'll cost the government just over $165 billion over the next decade to maintain the current negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions. That's $165 billion that could be going toward helping resolving the housing crisis instead of fueling it. Sure, I wouldn't expect Labor to do something radical like scrap it altogether, but even if they just targeted the top end of town, and politicians like using that phrase, there'd still be tens of billions of dollars to play with. And let's be honest, I doubt there'll be too many people feeling that much sympathy for property investors that have collected property as if they're playing Monopoly. Just think, the money the government could gain from changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions could be spent on building actual public housing. Or if you're absolutely shackled to the concept of the Housing Australia Future Fund and you love to cosplay as a Labor diehard while harbouring neoliberal tendencies, you could even dump the money gained from modifying negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions straight into the fund and start making sizable annual disbursements rather than the drip feeding we have today. The point is that if nothing else, taking action to curb negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions would provide the government with a sizable amount of coin that could make a real difference toward addressing the housing crisis.
Just on negative gearing, the questions yesterday were around whether you were considering changes. You said no, you're not. We then heard ministers saying that means future changes have been ruled out. But the question was very much in the present tense around considering those changes. Just for clarity, does negative gearing changes off the table before the next election and in subsequent terms?
Just for clarity, what we are doing is what we have before the Parliament. So I talk about what we're doing, not what we're not doing. And what we're doing is trying to get our legislation through the Parliament as part of our $32 billion Homes for Australia plan.
But on negative gearing still, there's a question around the future potential for changes. There was no answer there. We've heard yesterday you're not considering changes
I've
now.
said what we're doing and I've said what we're not doing. What we're doing is very clear, which is our Homes for Australia plan. That is
still not ruled out.
That is what we are doing. I am saying what we are doing, and I'm saying that is our focus, and our only focus is on that.
Crystal clear, sir.
Taking out the red pen and making changes should be a no-brainer, and more than that, it should be an easy sell if done properly. But I fear that given how they handled the conversation this week, Labor are either incapable of selling changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions, or unwilling to even try. Either way, I think we'll all lose. Well, maybe not all of us. If the government maintain the status quo, guys like this won't lose, or the donors. Maybe the system is working as intended then.